I'm not his father. The words echoed in my mind like a gunshot, sharp and deafening, leaving behind a crater of disbelief and pain. It was the kind of revelation that doesn't just break your heart, it shatters your entire existence. For 12 years, I had believed Atlas was mine, my son, my blood, my legacy. Every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every proud moment on the soccer field, I thought it was all ours, together. But now, standing in the sterile silence of our kitchen, clutching the DNA test results in trembling hands, I realized none of it was real. None of it belonged to me. Zara sat across from me, her face pale and tear-streaked, as though she'd been waiting for this moment, but dreading it all the same. "Collins," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of guilt. "I wanted to tell you. So many times." "Wanted to tell me what?" I snapped, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "That the boy I've raised since he was born isn't even mine? That you lied to me? For 12 years? She flinched at my tone, her eyes darting away as if she couldn't bear to look at me. And why should she? How could she possibly face the man whose life she'd built on lies? To understand how we ended up in this nightmare, you have to go back to the beginning, when Zara and I were still untainted by mistrust, and love felt infinite. We met during college, two wide-eyed dreamers navigating the chaos of youth. She was an art major with paint-stained fingers and a laugh that lit up rooms. I was a business student with big ambitions and a penchant for overthinking everything. On paper, we shouldn't have worked, but somehow we did. Our connection wasn't instant. It grew slowly, like roots digging deep into soil. At first, we were just study partners, bonding over late-night coffee runs and shared frustrations about professors who spoke in riddles. Then came inside jokes, like calling rainstorms nature's mood lighting, because Zara loved painting landscapes during thunderstorms, and lazy Sunday mornings spent binge-watching old movies while eating cereal straight from the box. By the time graduation rolled around, we were inseparable. Zara moved into my tiny apartment, bringing with her mismatched furniture and canvases stacked against the walls. We dreamed together about traveling the world, starting a family, building a life filled with laughter and meaning. When she told me she was pregnant 6 months later, I didn't hesitate. I dropped to one knee right there in the living room, surrounded by half-finished paintings and empty takeout containers, and asked her to marry me. And she said yes. Atlas arrived 9 months later, a perfect little miracle with Zara's curly hair and my, so I thought, stubborn chin. From the moment they placed him in my arms, I was hooked. Parenthood wasn't easy. Sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and tantrums that left us questioning our sanity, but it was worth every second. Watching Atlas grow felt like watching magic unfold before my eyes. His first steps, his first word, Dada, his first day of school. It was all part of a tapestry woven with joy, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Zara and I weren't perfect parents, but we tried. We celebrated milestones with homemade cakes and photo albums filled with memories. We argued over discipline styles. He was more of a free spirit while I leaned toward structure, but always found common ground. Our marriage wasn't without its challenges, but we weathered them together, or so I believed. Looking back now, I can see the cracks forming long before the truth came crashing down. There were subtle signs, things I dismissed as stress or exhaustion. Zara became distant, retreating into herself whenever I asked how she was feeling. She started working longer hours, claiming she needed space to focus on her career. Even our conversations dwindled, replaced by polite exchanges about groceries and bills. Still, I convinced myself everything was fine. After all, raising a child is hard. Marriage is hard. Maybe this was just a phase, a rough patch we'd get through like we always did. But deep down, doubt lingered. A nagging voice whispered that something wasn't right. I ignored it, burying myself in work and parenting duties instead of confronting the unease festering between us. The catalyst came unexpectedly. A routine doctor's visit turned into a life-altering discovery. Atlas had been experiencing persistent stomach aches, so Zara scheduled an appointment to rule out any serious issues. During the consultation, the pediatrician suggested running some tests, including a genetic screening to check for potential hereditary conditions. At first, I didn't think much of it. Genetic screenings are standard procedure these days, especially for families with no clear medical history. But when the results came back, they revealed something neither of us anticipated. Atlas didn't share my DNA. My initial reaction was denial. Surely there must be a mistake. Lab errors happen all the time, right? I demanded a retest, clinging to hope like a lifeline. But when the second set of results confirmed the first, reality hit like a freight train. Zara broke down when I confronted her, confessing everything through sobs. She admitted to having an affair early in our relationship, shortly before discovering she was pregnant. Panicked and unsure of the baby's paternity, she chose to keep the truth hidden, convincing herself it was better for everyone involved. Over time, the lie became ingrained in our lives, impossible to unravel without destroying everything we'd built. Her confession gutted me, not just because of the betrayal, but because of the magnitude of the deception. 12 years. 12 years of birthdays, holidays, and milestones, all built on a foundation of lies. If you're invested in this story and want to find out how Collins navigates the fallout of this devastating revelation, don't forget to hit that like button below. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or predictions. I'd love to hear what you think will happen next. And make sure to subscribe for more emotionally gripping tales like this one. Now, let's rewind slightly to explore the moments leading up to the DNA test, the subtle shifts in Zara and Collins' relationship, and the emotional bond they once shared, because understanding what they lost makes the betrayal sting that much more. Before the DNA test shattered my world, there were signs, small fractures in our relationship that I chose to ignore or dismiss as temporary. Looking back now, it's clear those cracks weren't new. They'd been forming for years, hidden beneath layers of routine and familiarity. But denial is a powerful thing. It allows you to convince yourself that everything is fine when deep down, you know it isn't. It started subtly, a shift so gradual I barely noticed it at first. Zara began working longer hours, claiming her art studio was swamped with commissions. At first, I believed her. Her career had always been important to her, and I wanted to support her dreams. But over time, her absences grew more frequent and her explanations less convincing. Another late night, I'd ask casually, trying to mask the irritation creeping into my voice. Yeah, she'd reply, avoiding eye contact. Deadlines don't wait. I told myself it was normal. Artists often poured themselves into their work, but something about her tone felt off. There was a tension in her words, a hesitancy that hinted at unspoken truths. Still, I let it slide, telling myself not to overthink things. After all, we both had responsibilities. Maybe this was just a phase. But then came the excuses. The missed family dinners, the canceled plans, the vague responses whenever I asked how her day went. Once, when Atlas asked why Mommy wasn't home yet, Zara snapped, "Because some of us actually have jobs, okay?" Her sharpness startled me and hurt Atlas, who looked up at her with wide, wounded eyes. She immediately apologized, blaming stress and fatigue, but the damage was done. That moment planted a seed of doubt in my mind, a tiny flicker of suspicion that maybe something deeper was going on. Despite the growing distance between Zara and me, Atlas remained the glue holding our family together. He was the one constant we could both agree on, the shared love that kept us tethered even as everything else unraveled. Watching him grow brought moments of pure joy. His laughter during tickle fights, his excitement over science experiments gone wrong, his quiet pride when he scored his first goal in soccer. Zara and I still found ways to connect through him. We cheered together at his games, argued good-naturedly over which bedtime stories to read, and celebrated milestones like birthdays and report cards. For a while, those shared experiences masked the underlying strain in our marriage. As long as Atlas was happy, we convinced ourselves we were too. But even Atlas couldn't shield us from the truth forever. One evening, after tucking him into bed, Zara and I sat in silence on the couch, the weight of unspoken grievances pressing down on us. Finally, I broke the quiet. "You've been distant lately," I said softly, glancing at her profile illuminated by the soft glow of the TV. "Is everything okay?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously around the hem of her sweater. "I'm just tired," she murmured. "Work's been stressful." Her answer didn't satisfy me. It never did anymore. But I nodded anyway, unwilling to push further. Confrontation had never been my strong suit. And besides, what if I was wrong? What if the problem really was as simple as stress? The real breaking point came during a weekend trip. A rare getaway, Zara suggested to reconnect. We rented a cabin near a lake, hoping the change of scenery would rekindle the spark we'd lost. Instead, it exposed just how far apart we'd drifted. On the second night, after putting Atlas to bed, we sat outside under the stars, sipping wine and pretending everything was fine. But the tension between us was palpable. Like an invisible wall, neither of us knew how to tear down. "I miss us," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I miss feeling like we're a team." Zara sighed, setting her glass down on the wooden railing. "I know," she said quietly. "Things haven't been great lately." "No kidding," I shot back, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You're never home anymore, Zara. You avoid talking to me. You snap at Atlas. What's going on with you?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might open up, might finally tell me the truth. Instead, she stood abruptly, brushing past me without a word. "Where are you going?" I called after her. "For a walk," she replied curtly, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed behind, staring out at the water, anger and sadness warring within me. This wasn't the woman I fell in love with. This wasn't the partner I vowed to stand by through thick and thin. Who was she now? And why did it feel like I no longer knew her? Despite the growing rift, there were still moments of hope, fleeting glimpses of the life we used to share. One morning, during that same trip, Zara surprised me with breakfast in bed. Pancakes shaped like hearts, fresh fruit, and coffee brewed exactly the way I liked it. "I'm sorry," she said softly, sitting beside me. "I don't mean to shut you out. I don't know how to fix things." Her vulnerability caught me off guard, melting some of the resentment I'd been harboring. "We can figure it out," I replied, reaching for her hand. "Together." For a brief moment, it felt like old times, the kind of connection that made me believe we could overcome anything. But the reprieve was short-lived. By the end of the trip, the tension returned, stronger than ever. Whatever progress we'd made evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Looking back, I realized those moments of closeness were fleeting because they weren't built on honesty. Beneath the surface, Zara carried a secret too heavy to share, one that would eventually destroy everything we'd worked so hard to build. The signs were there if I'd only paid attention. Her reluctance to discuss the past, her defensiveness whenever I asked about Atlas's resemblance to her side of the family, the way she sometimes looked at him with an expression I couldn't quite place. Guilt, regret, love. But I ignored them all, choosing instead to cling to the illusion of perfection. After all, admitting the truth meant facing a reality too painful to bear. So I buried my doubts, focusing instead on the life we'd created, the life I believed was ours. Little did I know, the foundation of that life was built on sand, destined to crumble the moment the tide rolled in. The cracks in our marriage widened with each passing day, until the space between Zara and me felt like an unbridgeable chasm. What had once been a sanctuary of shared laughter and whispered dreams now felt suffocating, a house filled with echoes of what we used to be. We were still living under the same roof, raising Atlas together, but emotionally, we existed on separate planets. Our conversations dwindled to perfunctory exchanges about groceries or school schedules, devoid of warmth or intimacy. Even when we sat inches apart on the couch, the silence between us was deafening, heavy with everything left unsaid. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I came home to find Zara sitting cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her expression was unreadable, her posture rigid. Without thinking, I snapped, "Why are you just sitting here? Dinner isn't even started." Her head jerked up, surprise quickly giving way to anger. "Excuse me," she shot back, her voice sharp. "Maybe if you didn't work yourself into the ground every single day, we wouldn't have these problems." My jaw tightened as resentment bubbled to the surface. "Oh, I'm the problem? Funny, because last I checked, you've been distant and distracted for weeks. How am I supposed to fix things when you won't even tell me what's wrong?" For a moment, we stared at each other, the air crackling with unresolved tension. Then, without another word, Zara stormed out of the room, leaving me standing alone amidst the wreckage of yet another failed attempt at connection. These arguments became a recurring pattern, small misunderstandings escalating into full-blown fights, fueled by frustration and exhaustion. Each confrontation drove us further apart, creating new wounds while reopening old ones. The love we once shared hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had become buried beneath layers of mistrust, guilt, and unspoken fears. Caught in the crossfire of our deteriorating relationship was Atlas. At 12 years old, he was old enough to sense the tension between us, but too young to fully understand its cause. He began withdrawing, spending more time in his room playing video games or sketching in notebooks. Once, during dinner, he looked up from his plate and asked hesitantly, "Are you guys getting divorced?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. Zara and I exchanged panicked glances before simultaneously assuring him that no, we weren't getting divorced. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, not just in Atlas's mind, but in ours as well. Was this really sustainable? Could we continue pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't? Zara tried to compensate by showering Atlas with attention, taking him on outings, and buying him gifts. While part of me appreciated her effort, another part resented it, a childish voice whispering that she was overcompensating for something. Meanwhile, I threw myself into being the fun dad, organizing weekend adventures and coaching Atlas's soccer team. It was as though we were competing for his affection, each trying to prove we were the better parent. But deep down, I knew neither of us was winning. Atlas deserved stability, not a tug-of-war between two fractured adults who couldn't communicate. As the emotional distance between Zara and me grew, external temptations crept in. For me, it was Carson, a colleague who seemed to appear whenever I needed someone to vent to. She was smart, empathetic, and refreshingly straightforward, qualities that made her easy to talk to. Over lunch breaks and late-night coffee runs, we bonded over shared frustrations about work-life balance and parenting struggles. At first, our interactions were harmless. A friendly ear, a sympathetic nod, but over time, they grew more personal, bordering on flirtatious. Carson would linger too long during conversations, her hand brushing mine accidentally as she handed me documents. Once, after a particularly stressful meeting, she offered to take me out for drinks, saying, "You look like you could use someone who actually listens." Part of me wanted to push her away, to remind myself that I was married and committed to fixing things with Zara. But another part, a darker, more vulnerable part, found comfort in the attention. Carson's presence was a temporary escape from the chaos at home, a reminder that I was still desirable, still worth pursuing. Meanwhile, Zara seemed equally distracted by someone else, Adriel, an old flame who suddenly reappeared in her life after years of absence. They spent hours texting and talking on the phone, their conversations hushed and secretive. On several occasions, I caught glimpses of messages on her screen, nothing overtly suspicious, but enough to plant seeds of doubt in my already fragile mind. Was she confiding in Adriel about our struggles? Or was there something more going on? The jealousy gnawed at me, twisting my thoughts into knots. I hated myself for feeling this way, for letting insecurity creep in and poison what little trust remained. Yet I couldn't shake the fear that Zara might find solace, or worse, affection, with someone else. One particularly brutal night, the tension reached its breaking point. We'd been invited to a mutual friend's wedding, an event neither of us particularly wanted to attend, but felt obligated to endure. Throughout the evening, Zara barely acknowledged my presence, instead spending most of her time chatting animatedly with Adriel. Watching them laugh together, heads tilted close in conspiratorial whispers, sent a spike of irrational anger coursing through me. During the reception, as couples swayed to the music and champagne flowed freely, I approached Zara, my patience worn, paper thin. "Can we go home?" I asked tersely, trying to mask my irritation. She frowned, clearly annoyed. "We just got here. Why don't you enjoy yourself for once instead of being such a buzzkill?" "Enjoy myself? Really? That's rich coming from someone who's been avoiding me like the plague for weeks." I shot back, throwing my hands up in exasperation. Several guests turned to stare, their expressions a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Zara's cheeks flushed crimson as she grabbed my arm and dragged me outside, her grip surprisingly strong. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed once we were alone, her voice low but venomous. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing you are right now?" "Embarrassing? Really? That's rich coming from someone who lied about being pregnant." I shot back, my voice rising despite her attempts to shush me. Her face paled, and for a split second guilt flickered in her eyes. But it vanished almost instantly, replaced by cold defiance. "You wouldn't understand," she said icily, "not when you're too busy flirting with your coworker to notice anything else." Her words cut deeper than any blade ever could. In that moment, I realized how far gone we truly were. The woman standing before me was a stranger, her eyes clouded with suspicion and bitterness. Gone was the vivacious spirit who once lit up my world. In her place stood someone hardened and unreachable. Unable to respond, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the cool night air. As I drove home, tears streaming down my face, I couldn't help but wonder, was this really the end? Had we reached a point of no return? That night, after leaving Zara standing alone outside the wedding venue, I drove home with my mind racing. A storm of anger, hurt, and confusion swirling inside me. My chest felt tight, like an invisible hand was squeezing all the air out of my lungs. I replayed our argument over and over again, dissecting every word she'd said, every accusation flung between us. But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, one question kept circling back, relentless and unyielding. Why? Why had she lied about Atlas being mine? Why did she shut me out when I needed her most? And why, despite everything, did I still care so deeply for someone who seemed determined to destroy what we had? When I arrived home, the house was dark and eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, letting the burn of alcohol momentarily distract from the ache in my chest. Sitting on the couch, I stared blankly at the wall, my thoughts spiraling until exhaustion finally took over. Sometime later, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of keys jingling in the lock. Zara walked in slowly, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She paused when she saw me sitting there, her face unreadable in the dim light. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply stood frozen, two strangers occupying the same space but worlds apart emotionally. Then, without warning, she broke down. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. Tears streamed down her face as she sank onto the armchair across from me, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. This wasn't the defensive, guarded Zara I'd grown accustomed to seeing these past few weeks. This was the raw, unfiltered version of her, the one I thought I'd lost forever. Against my better judgment, I leaned forward, bracing myself for whatever she was about to say. "Tell me the truth, Zara," I said quietly, my tone softer than I expected. "No more lies, no more half-truths, just tell me why." She hesitated, wiping her tears with trembling hands. When she finally spoke, her words came tumbling out in a rush, as though she'd been holding them in for far too long. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan any of it, I swear. It started as a stupid idea, something I convinced myself would fix everything. I thought if I told you Atlas was yours, it would force us to stay together, to work through our problems instead of drifting further apart." Her confession hit me like a freight train, knocking the wind out of me. So that's what this was about, a desperate attempt to salvage a relationship she feared losing. But even as understanding flickered within me, anger simmered just beneath the surface. "You lied to me," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside. "You manipulated me. Did you ever stop to think about how that would make me feel, about how much it would hurt?" "I know," she choked out, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "And I hate myself for it. Every day, I've hated myself for doing this to you, to us. But I was scared, okay? Scared that you were slipping away from me. Scared that I wasn't enough anymore. I thought maybe if I gave you a reason to stay, you wouldn't leave." Her words cut deeper than any blade ever could. All this time, I'd assumed her actions stemmed from selfishness or control. But now I saw the truth. They came from fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of inadequacy. Fear of losing the person she loved most. But knowing her motivations didn't erase the pain she'd caused. If anything, it made it worse. Because now I understood just how broken we both were. "What about Adriel?" I asked suddenly, the question bursting forth before I could stop it. "Is he the real reason you've been pulling away?" Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with indignation. "Adriel, are you serious right now? He's just a friend, an old friend who happens to actually listen when I talk. Unlike you, apparently." Her words stung, but they also rang true. How many times had I dismissed her concerns, brushed off her attempts to communicate, or retreated into my own world instead of meeting her halfway? Guilt settled heavily in my gut, adding another layer of complexity to the mess we'd created. For several minutes, we sat in silence, the weight of our shared failures pressing down on us. Finally, Zara spoke again, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't want to lose you," she admitted, looking directly at me for the first time in what felt like ages. "But I can't keep pretending either. This isn't working. We're not working." Her words hung in the air, sharp and final. A part of me wanted to argue, to beg her to give us another chance, but deep down I knew she was right. Our relationship had become a cycle of mistrust and resentment, each betrayal chipping away at the foundation until nothing solid remained. The next morning I woke up to find Zara gone. On the dining table she'd left a note scrawled hastily on a piece of paper. "I need some time to figure things out, for both of us. Please don't follow me." Panic surged through me as I read those words, my heart pounding wildly. Where had she gone? Was this temporary, or was she walking away for good? The uncertainty gnawed at me, leaving me restless and anxious. Over the following days, I threw myself into work, using deadlines and meetings as distractions from the emptiness threatening to consume me. Friends called and texted, offering support and advice, but their well-meaning words only reminded me of how isolated I felt. Without Zara, the world seemed duller, quieter, as though someone had turned down the volume on life itself. Then, unexpectedly, a call came that changed everything. It was Zara's sister Collins, her voice urgent and strained. "You need to come to the hospital," she said without preamble. "It's Zara." My blood ran cold. What happened? "She collapsed earlier today," Collins explained quickly. "They're running tests now, but it doesn't look good." Without hesitation, I grabbed my keys and raced to the hospital, my mind a whirlwind of fear and dread. When I arrived, Collins met me in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. "They found tumors," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Brain tumors. They're saying it's advanced." The room spun around me as her words sank in. Zara, my fierce, vibrant Zara, was sick. Terminal illness wasn't something we'd ever imagined facing, especially not now, when our relationship was already hanging by a thread. I rushed to her bedside, where she lay hooked up to machines, her frail form dwarfed by the sterile hospital sheets. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard my footsteps, and for a brief moment, relief washed over her features. "You came," she murmured weakly, reaching for my hand. "Of course I came," I replied, gripping her fingers tightly. "I'm not going anywhere." As I sat beside her, watching her struggle to stay awake, something shifted within me. The anger, the betrayal, the resentment. It all faded into the background, replaced by a single overwhelming realization. I still loved her. More than anything, I wanted to fight for her, to be there for her in whatever time we had left together. In the weeks that followed, Zara and I embarked on a journey neither of us had anticipated, rebuilding trust while grappling with the uncertainty of her prognosis. It wasn't easy. There were moments when fear threatened to consume us, when the weight of her diagnosis loomed so heavily that breathing felt impossible. But slowly, incrementally, we found ways to reconnect, not as lovers clinging desperately to the past, but as two people determined to cherish whatever time they had left together. One afternoon, as we sat in the hospital garden, Zara turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Remember that road trip we took last summer?" she asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "How could I forget? You got us lost 3 times before we finally found that diner with the world's best pie." She laughed softly, the sound like music after months of silence. "We should do it again," she said, her expression turning serious. "Not the getting lost part, obviously. Just go somewhere, anywhere. Make some memories while we still can." Her request caught me off guard, but deep down, I knew she was right. Life, no matter how fleeting, deserved to be lived fully. So, against medical advice and logistical challenges, we planned a trip, a modest one given her condition, but meaningful nonetheless. We rented a small cabin near a lake, far removed from the sterile walls of hospitals and the relentless ticking of clocks. Those days at the lake became some of the most beautiful of our lives. We spent mornings fishing off the dock, afternoons exploring nearby trails, and evenings curled up by the fireplace, sharing stories and laughter until our sides ached. On the final night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Zara leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for this, for giving me peace." Her words brought tears to my eyes, but I managed to smile. "Thank you," I replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "for reminding me what love really means." Time, however, is an unforgiving force. Despite our efforts to create joy in the present, Zara's health continued to decline. By winter, she was back in the hospital, weaker than before, but still fighting with every ounce of strength she had. One snowy evening, as I sat beside her bed, reading aloud from one of her favorite novels, she interrupted me mid-sentence. "I need you to promise me something," she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of machines. "Anything," I replied without hesitation. "When I'm gone," she began, pausing to gather her breath, "don't stop living. Don't let grief keep you trapped in the past. Promise me you'll find happiness again, even if it's not with me." Her request shattered me, but I nodded through my tears. "I promise," I choked out, clutching her hand tightly. "But you're not going anywhere yet. Not tonight, not tomorrow." She smiled faintly, her eyes closing as exhaustion claimed her. That night marked the beginning of the end, a slow, painful unraveling that tested every fiber of my being. When Zara passed away 2 weeks later, surrounded by loved ones and bathed in soft candlelight, I felt as though a part of me died with her. In the months that followed, grief consumed me. Days blurred into nights, each one heavier than the last. Yet even in the depths of despair, Zara's final wish echoed in my mind: find happiness again. At first, the idea seemed impossible. How could I move forward without her? How could anyone else measure up to the love we'd shared? But healing isn't linear, and neither is growth. Slowly, I began to rediscover pieces of myself I'd lost along the way. The writer who once dreamed of crafting epic tales, the adventurer who craved exploration, the friend who valued connection above all else. I started journaling, pouring my emotions onto paper in hopes of making sense of them. I reconnected with old friends, leaning on their support during dark times. And eventually, I returned to the places Zara and I had loved together, not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what had been. One spring afternoon, while hiking a trail we'd visited during happier times, I stumbled upon a patch of wild flowers blooming defiantly against the rocky terrain. They reminded me of Zara, resilient, vibrant, unforgettable. As I knelt to take a closer look, I realized something profound. Love doesn't die when someone leaves. It transforms. It becomes a part of you, shaping who you are and guiding you toward the future. And so, here I am today, scarred but whole, heartbroken but hopeful. Love taught me many lessons, but perhaps the greatest was this: even in loss, there is light, if only we have the courage to seek it.